Sometimes the most extraordinary moments unfold in the most unlikely places. Places where no one expects greatness to emerge. A dusty airstrip, the harsh wind carrying the scent of jet fuel, and the promise of an impending storm. It's here, in this unassuming corner of the world that lives are about to change forever. No boardroom, no polished speeches, just raw, unfiltered truth. Ethan Price was a mechanic gritty grounded and completely unaffected by the polished world he was about to step into. His clothes were soaked with grease, his boots scuffed from miles of hard labor, and his hands, well, they carried the marks of a lifetime spent fixing what others discarded. The moment he pulled his battered pickup truck onto the tarmac, no one seemed to notice him. But to be honest, Ethan didn't need their attention. He wasn't there for applause or recognition. He was there because a jet high above the sky was on the verge of disaster, and only he could save it. In the distance behind the gleaming walls of the executive lounge, a crowd of well-dressed men watched with smug smiles, convinced that failure was inevitable. They sipped their coffee and exchanged glances, dismissing the mechanic in his worn flannel shirt and dusty boots as nothing more than a sideshow. To them, this was a spectacle, a moment of amusement. But little did they know, this was about to be the most important moment of the day, if not their lives. The jet before Ethan wasn't just any plane, it belonged to Isabella Hayes, the CEO of Sky Horizon Group, a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by luxury and control. She watched from behind the glass, her eyes narrowing as she observed the mechanic's every move. There was something different about him, something that the polished men in suits couldn't see. As they laughed and joked, Isabella wasn't laughing. She was watching a man who carried himself with quiet determination, unaffected by the noise around him. Ethan didn't flinch as the executives scoffed, didn't look up as they pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be a disaster. His world had never been one of suits and boardrooms. His world was made of engines, sweat, and the quiet code of fixing what others had given up on. As he approached the broken jet, each step seemed to echo louder than the idle chatter behind the glass. With every movement, Ethan's confidence grew, while the world around him began to fade into the background. The air was thick with tension, but Ethan was focused, determined. He didn't care for the cynicism behind him. There was no time for doubt. The jet needed saving, and Ethan was the only one who could do it. He didn't need to impress anyone. He was here to get the job done. And as the mechanics of the jet came to life under his hands, something began to shift, not just for the plane, but for the woman watching it all unfold from behind the glass. This was the beginning of a moment that would change everything. Ethan Price and Isabella Hayes couldn't have been more different. Ethan the mechanic was a man of few words with a life forged by hard work and grit. His world was not one of boardrooms or business deals. It was the world of engines grease and the quiet satisfaction of making things work again. His clothes were worn stained with oil and sweat, and his boots, well, they had seen more miles than most jets. To him, every turn of the wrench, every twist of a bolt was a small victory, the kind that came from fixing something that others had given up on. He didn't chase recognition or applause. For Ethan, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about getting the job done, saving what needed saving. On the other hand, Isabella Hayes was a woman who had been born into a life of privilege, power, and expectations. As the CEO of Sky Horizon Group, she lived in a world of suits, briefcases, and high-stakes decisions. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who polished their words and their actions until they gleamed, people who carried themselves with the poise and precision that came from being born into wealth. Isabella's life was a constant balancing act of power plays and public appearances of meeting expectations that had been set for her before she was even born. Her world was one of perfection, every detail meticulously crafted, every move calculated. She had everything anyone could want: a successful career, an enviable status, and a reputation that was beyond reproach. And yet, despite their stark differences, there was something about Ethan that caught Isabella's attention. As she watched him from the comfort of her executive lounge surrounded by polished men in expensive suits, she couldn't help but notice the way he moved. There was a quiet confidence in him, a steadiness that was in stark contrast to the fast-paced, high-strung world she knew. While the executives behind the glass chuckled and exchanged smirks, certain that Ethan would fail, Isabella saw something different. She saw a man who was unbothered by the noise around him, someone who was not here to impress, but simply to do what needed to be done. Ethan didn't care about the luxury of Isabella's world. He wasn't interested in the polished boardrooms or the flashing cameras that followed her every move. He didn't look up at the executives who were recording him with their phones waiting for him to fail. To Ethan, their laughter and sneers meant nothing. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, saving the jet. For him, the value of the work didn't come from the title or the money attached to it. It came from the skill, the precision, and the satisfaction of doing something right. No matter who was watching, Isabella, on the other hand, was used to being watched, to being scrutinized, and to having her every move analyzed by those around her. In her world, appearances were everything. The men in their suits, the glass walls, the constant hum of business deals, they were all part of the show. But Ethan didn't care about the show. He didn't care about how he looked or what anyone thought. His world was one of substance, not style. He had no need to prove anything to anyone because his work spoke for itself. As Isabella watched Ethan work, something in her began to shift. There was a quiet humility in him that she had never encountered before. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't putting on an act or trying to gain anyone's approval. He was just a man doing his job, doing it well, with a level of expertise that Isabella couldn't ignore. She had spent her life surrounded by people who wore their success like armor, people who spoke in polished tones and hid their insecurities behind their titles. But Ethan was different. He didn't need a title to define him. He didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. In that moment, Isabella felt a pull toward him that she couldn't explain. It wasn't about his appearance or his background. It was about something deeper. It was about the raw authenticity that radiated from him, something she had long buried under layers of expectations and societal pressures. For the first time in a long time, Isabella felt as if she were witnessing something real. Something untainted by the world of appearances that she had been born into. Ethan, with his grease-streaked clothes and weathered boots, was everything Isabella had never allowed herself to be. He was unafraid of the mess, unafraid of the imperfections, and most importantly, unafraid to be himself. As she watched him repair the jet with such calm determination, she realized that there was something beautiful in his simplicity, something that her polished world could never offer. Their worlds were as different as night and day. But somehow in that moment, it didn't matter. Ethan wasn't there to compete with her world. He wasn't trying to take anything from her. He was simply doing what he did best, and in doing so, he was offering something to Isabella that she hadn't realized. She needed the freedom to let go of the perfect facade and embrace something real. Isabella had spent her life chasing perfection, both in herself and in the world around her. But Ethan, with his quiet confidence and raw authenticity, had shown her that sometimes the most valuable thing isn't what we build or how we appear to others. It's what we dare to believe in when nobody else does. And perhaps it's what we choose to embrace when we stop pretending to be something we're not. As the jet's engine roared to life and Ethan finished his work, Isabella realized that their worlds, so different, so far apart, were beginning to collide in a way that neither of them could have expected. And in that collision, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. The tarmac was quiet, except for the distant murmur of men in suits, the occasional clink of coffee cups, and the hum of a jet that had just been brought to the brink of disaster. Ethan Price, with his grease-streaked clothes and worn boots, stood in front of the imposing aircraft, now silent and still, as if waiting for someone to come and fix it. And that someone was him. Ethan didn't flinch at the gravity of the task ahead. He had seen it all before. Broken engines beyond repair jobs that people had written off. But this jet. This wasn't just any plane. This was a high-profile aircraft, a machine that belonged to one of the wealthiest women in the world, Isabella Hayes, the CEO of Sky Horizon Group. The lives of not only the executives watching from the glass-walled lounge, but also the passengers, most likely. The elite of society depended on Ethan's ability to work miracles. The crowd behind the glass lounge had already dismissed him. Their laughter was thick with condescension, their judgment clouded by their polished appearances and expensive suits. To them, Ethan was just a mechanic, just a guy from the wrong side of the tracks. But Ethan had something they didn't: the knowledge and skill to save a life, to fix something when no one else could. This was his world, one of engine's dirt and the unspoken code of fixing what others gave up on. Isabella Hayes watched all of this unfold, her sharp eyes following Ethan's every movement. She stood behind the glass wall, her thoughts swirling in a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She had expected him to be nervous, to flinch at the pressure of such a high-stakes job. Instead, he was calm, methodical, his hands working with a quiet urgency. Every movement was deliberate, precise. He wasn't bothered by the eyes that watched him, by the sneers and the whispers. He had a job to do, and nothing would distract him from it. Isabella leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging a small circle against the cold pane. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who polished their words until they gleamed, who performed for her approval. CEOs, politicians, pilots. They all spoke with the same rehearsed confidence, the same practiced smiles. But Ethan was different. He didn't care about impressing her or anyone else. He didn't need to prove himself. All he cared about was the jet and the life it held in its wings. As Ethan worked, Isabella began to see something she hadn't noticed before. A quiet brilliance in him that she hadn't expected. His movements were so sure, so confident. Yet there was no arrogance, no bravado. He wasn't the kind of man who needed attention. He was the kind of man who fixed problems, who saw things for what they were, and worked tirelessly to solve them. The way he worked on the engine with such focused concentration was unlike anything she had ever seen in her world. Her world, after all, was built on appearances, on the polished and refined, but Ethan's world was built on reality. He didn't need a title to define him. He didn't need validation from the people who laughed behind glass windows. His hands, worn and calloused, told the story of his life, a life spent fixing things that were broken, a life spent working with his hands and with machines, bringing them back to life when they had been discarded. Ethan could feel the weight of Isabella's gaze on him, but he didn't look up. He had a job to do, and nothing would distract him from it. Every movement was precise, every decision deliberate. As he unwrapped the damaged fuel line and exposed the inner workings of the aircraft, his mind raced with calculations. How much time he had, what tools were needed, which parts could be salvaged. He could feel the tension building in the air, but he stayed calm. There was no room for panic in his world. There was no time for mistakes. He had worked on broken engines in the hot sun, in the cold winds, and in the dimly lit hangars where people were just as broken as the machines they tried to fix. This was just another day. For Isabella, this moment was unlike any she had ever experienced. She had spent her life surrounded by people who were trained to perform, who knew how to put on a show. But Ethan was different. He wasn't performing. He was just being himself, doing what he was born to do. She could see the focus in his eyes, the way he shut out everything around him to fix the problem in front of him. And somehow in that moment she realized that this was what she had been missing in her own life. Someone who didn't perform for an audience, but someone who simply did the right thing because it needed to be done. As Ethan worked, Isabella's admiration for him grew. She had been born into wealth and power, but all of that had come at a cost. She had spent so much time building an empire, chasing titles and accolades, that she had lost sight of the simple things that made life worthwhile. Watching Ethan, a man who had nothing but his skill and his work ethic, she began to question everything she had built. Was it worth it? Was it worth all the pressure, all the expectations, all the things that came with the polished world she lived in? The moment stretched on, but for Isabella time seemed to slow. She could hear nothing but the soft hum of Ethan's movements, the clink of his tools, and the steady beat of his heart as he worked to save the jet. She was so absorbed in his quiet competence that she almost forgot to breathe. Then, just as Ethan was finishing up, the engine coughed to life with a low rumble. The jet, which had been on the brink of disaster, suddenly came alive. Isabella watched, astonished. The engine roared to life, steady and strong, as if it had never been broken. It wasn't just a repair. It was a rebirth. Ethan had done what no one else could. He had saved the jet, and in doing so, he had changed everything. Isabella stood there, still watching Ethan, but her mind was racing. She had come to watch a mechanic fail. Instead, she had witnessed a miracle. She had witnessed a man who had not only fixed a machine, but who had shown her what it meant to truly live. The quiet strength, the unshakable confidence, the dedication to the task, these were the qualities that had captivated her. She had spent her life building walls around her heart, but Ethan had just torn one of them down. as Ethan wiped his hands on a rag preparing to leave. Isabella's thoughts swirled. What had she just witnessed? It wasn't just a mechanic fixing an aircraft. It was something deeper, something that had shifted inside her. And as she stood there watching him walk away with quiet dignity, she knew that this moment, this act of saving a jet had marked the beginning of something new, not just for the jet, but for her as well. The moment Ethan finished his work, the hum of the engine pulsed through the air, steady and alive. The jet, once on the verge of catastrophe, now stood ready, a symbol of resilience and rebirth. It was a miracle. Something that no one in the polished executive lounge had expected to see. As Ethan wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days, he stood there looking at the machine he had just saved, his face calm and composed, as if this was just another day in his world. He didn't need accolades or applause, he had done what needed to be done. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, Ethan didn't realize that everything had changed. Not just for the jet, but for the woman watching him from behind the glass. Isabella Hayes, standing in the executive lounge, felt a surge of emotions flood her chest. She had watched him work, no theatrics, no performance, just a man doing what he did best. There was no smirk, no self-congratulatory smile on his face as the jet came to life. He simply moved with quiet purpose, unaffected by the world around him. His hands, rough from years of hard work, had brought the jet back from the brink of disaster. But it wasn't just the jet that had been revived. In that moment, something inside Isabella stirred. Something she had long suppressed under layers of expectations and responsibilities. For as long as she could remember, Isabella had been trapped in a world of power, appearances, and obligations. She had been raised to lead, to build an empire, and to meet the expectations that had been placed upon her before she even had a voice of her own. But Ethan didn't live by anyone's expectations. He didn't care about appearances or titles. He simply worked, did what needed to be done, and lived a life rooted in authenticity. In him she saw the rawness of real life, a life far removed from the polished world she inhabited. He had shown her, without even realizing it, what it meant to be real, to be true to oneself, to choose the things that mattered. As Ethan finished his task, Isabella's heart raced. She had spent her entire life building walls around her walls that had kept her protected, kept her safe in the world she knew. But Ethan had broken through those walls, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with his quiet strength, his humble skill, and his unshakable sense of self. She had never met anyone like him before. No one in her world had ever made her feel like this. Like she could finally breathe, like she didn't have to be perfect or polished, like she could just be herself. And then, without thinking, without warning, the words escaped her mouth. "What if I asked you to marry me?" It was a bold proposal, one that surprised even herself. The question hung in the air, pregnant with the weight of what she had just said. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the carefully curated life she had built for herself. But in that moment, it felt right. She didn't want a life built on expectations, on appearances, or on legacy. She wanted something real. And Ethan, this mechanic who had done more than just fix a jet, had shown her that real was possible, that truth could be found outside the walls of her empire. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't mock her. He didn't treat her words like a joke or a publicity stunt, which is what she had expected. Instead, he stood there looking at her with calm, steady eyes, as if he were trying to understand the depth of what she had just said. It wasn't a reaction she had expected. It was too real, too grounded for her world of polished smiles and carefully controlled actions. "You don't even know me," Ethan said quietly, his voice low, but not dismissive. There was no anger in his tone, no surprise or disbelief, just a simple, thoughtful observation. Isabella felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger. "That's why I'm asking," she replied, her voice softening, almost as if she were making a confession. She wasn't asking him for a partnership based on convenience or expectation. She was asking him for something raw, something real, a chance at a future built on truth, and not on the polished facades of the world they came from. Her words seemed to hang in the air between them, a question that was more than just about a marriage proposal. It was a question about the life she had been living and the life she now wanted to choose. The executives, the staff, the men in suits who had been watching this whole interaction behind the glass, none of them had understood what Isabella was seeking. They had been caught up in appearances, in the grand gestures, in the performance of power and status. But Isabella wasn't interested in any of that anymore. She wanted something simpler, something truer. Ethan took a moment, just a brief one, to process her words. And then, without missing a beat, he did something that shocked Isabella. "If you're serious," he said, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "take off your shoes." The simplicity of his request took Isabella off guard. She blinked, trying to process what he had just said. "What?" she asked, her voice betraying a mix of surprise and curiosity. "If you're really serious about this," he continued, nodding toward the ground between them, "the walk with me barefoot. No titles, no brands, just you and me." It was a challenge, a small one but a monumental one at the same time. In that simple request, Ethan was asking Isabella to shed the layers of her world, the designer heels, the tailored suits, the carefully curated image she had built over the years. He was asking her to step away from the expectations, the walls, and the legacy that had always defined her. He wasn't just asking her to walk with him. He was asking her to step into a new reality, one where she could finally be herself, free from the pressure of being the perfect CEO, the perfect heiress, the perfect woman. Isabella hesitated just for a moment. It wasn't about the shoes. It was about what they represented. Her hesitation was the last vestige of the life she had known, the life she had always been told to live. But deep down she knew she couldn't stay in that world any longer. She had already felt the shift inside her when she watched Ethan work, when she saw the simplicity and authenticity he brought to everything he did. And now, as she stood before him, she knew this was the moment that would change everything. Without another word, Isabella bent down, slipped off one heel and then the other, the hot concrete searing briefly against her bare feet. She straightened, looking Ethan in the eye, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lead the way," she said, her voice steady, even though the nerves inside her were raging. Ethan smiled, a smile that wasn't mocking or condescending, but one that welcomed her into a new world. And together, they stepped forward, leaving behind the polished world she had known and walking into the unknown hand in hand. It was a proposal that had no ring, no ceremony, no grand gestures, but it was real, and for Isabella, that was enough. The runway stretched out before them, wide and open, the concrete beneath Isabella's bare feet, warm from the early morning sun. She had walked this path before, highly polished shoes clicking against the tarmac, the weight of her world heavy with expectations, with titles and legacies. Yet this time, the sound of her footsteps was different. Barefoot. The heat of the ground felt raw and real, and for the first time in years, Isabella felt like she could breathe. She wasn't just walking on the runway. She was walking away, away from the life she had been born into, the life of polished boardrooms, media attention, and corporate empires, away from the life of constant perfection, of never being allowed to be anything less than flawless. She had lived her entire existence in the glare of the spotlight, trying to live up to the expectations of those around her. But it had never been her own choice. Now, in the quiet presence of Ethan, a man who had no interest in titles or wealth, Isabella had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for: the chance to choose for herself. Every step she took felt like shedding a layer of armor. She was leaving behind the high heels, the tailored suits, and the constant pressure to maintain the image of an heiress and a CEO. She was stepping into a reality where she didn't have to pretend, a reality where what mattered wasn't her legacy, but the person she was beneath all the titles and roles she had been forced to play. She was walking away from the life that had been built for her, and in doing so, she was walking toward the life she had always longed for: a life filled with truth, simplicity, and the quiet joy of being herself. As they moved across the tarmac together, hand in hand, the world around them began to fade into the background. The flashing cameras, the reporters' questions, the expectations, they all blurred into insignificance. It was just Isabella and Ethan now. Two people connected not by wealth or status, but by something far more profound: authenticity. Ethan, who had never asked for fame, who had never cared for recognition, was the very embodiment of the life Isabella had spent years running from. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need a legacy or a title. He simply lived working with his hands, doing the things that mattered to him. And that in itself was revolutionary for Isabella. She had spent her life trying to make the world see her as someone important, someone worthy of admiration. But in Ethan she had found someone who had no need for admiration, and that made him more important than any title she could ever hold. He didn't need to be validated by society. He had already validated himself by living true to his values and passions. And for the first time in years, Isabella found herself asking, "What have I been chasing all this time?" Her steps slowed as she neared the edge of the airfield, where the polished world she had always known began to fade away. The hangars were old and worn, their paint peeling and rust creeping along the edges of the metal. The contrast between this forgotten corner of the airport and the sleek luxury of the jet she had just rescued wasn't lost on her. This was the reality she'd been avoiding for so long, the part of life that was raw, imperfect, and real. She had spent so many years clinging to the idea that success was measured by wealth, by power, by being in control. But now, standing here with Ethan, she understood that true success was found in something simpler. Living honestly, being true to oneself, and choosing love over legacy. "Ethan," she said softly, breaking the silence between them as they approached an old, weathered hangar. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, but for what I was never asked to be anything other than what everyone else wanted me to be. And in doing that I lost myself." Her voice wavered slightly, the weight of her words settling in. She could feel the truth of it deep within her. Ethan, walking beside her, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His quiet presence, his steady hand in hers, spoke volumes. He didn't need to fill the silence with words. He had already given her everything she needed in the way he had worked, in the way he had treated her. There was no performance, no need to impress. Just a simple man living a simple life, choosing the truth over the facade of success that had defined her for so long. As they reached the old hangar, Isabella stopped and looked at the rusted doors, the peeling paint, and the forgotten corners of the airport. This was where Ethan's world began, where he had learned the value of hard work, of integrity, and of real connections. And it was here, in this humble place, that Isabella realized she was no longer the woman who had walked onto this tarmac hours earlier. She wasn't the CEO, the heiress, or the polished figurehead of a powerful empire. She was simply Isabella, a woman who had found the freedom to choose herself. And as they entered the hangar together, leaving behind the flashing cameras and the polished world of Sky Horizon Group, Isabella made a promise to herself. She would no longer live in the shadow of the expectations others had placed on her. She would no longer chase fame, fortune, or legacy. She would walk beside Ethan not as a woman defined by her family's wealth or her career, but as a woman who had chosen to live with truth and love. In that moment, Isabella Hayes was free, not because she had abandoned everything she had built, but because she had finally chosen something far more valuable: the chance to live authentically, to embrace the real, imperfect, beautiful life that awaited her. With Ethan by her side, she knew she was walking into a future that was her own to create. As Isabella stood there looking out at the open sky before her, a profound realization washed over her. The world she had spent her entire life building, the empire, the wealth, the legacy, was no longer enough. It had never truly been hers to begin with. For years she had followed a path set for her by expectations, by the people around her, by the image of perfection and power that everyone else had shaped for her. But none of it had ever felt truly hers. None of it had ever made her feel truly alive. She had spent so much time trying to be everything the world expected her to be: a successful CEO, a leader in her field, a woman of power and influence. But as she walked barefoot beside Ethan, the rough concrete beneath her feet, she understood something deep within herself. Freedom wasn't just about leaving behind the trappings of wealth and status. It wasn't about abandoning the legacy her family had built for her. It was about choosing to live a life that was hers, a life that wasn't dictated by anyone else's standards, a life where she could finally be her true self. In that moment, Isabella knew that what she had been chasing all along, the success, the approval, the image, was nothing more than a shadow of what she truly needed. It wasn't about the fame, the titles, or the accolades. It wasn't about pleasing others or living up to the expectations of her family and the world. It was about living authentically, choosing happiness over obligation, and embracing a life of true freedom. As she looked at Ethan walking beside her with no concern for the world's judgment, Isabella realized that he had shown her something she had never known. Ethan wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He didn't need a title or a legacy to define who he was. He was content with his simple, honest life, living by the principles of hard work and integrity. And in that simplicity, in that authenticity, he had found freedom. He had never allowed anyone else to define him. And in doing so, he had discovered the true meaning of life. Isabella had spent so long trying to fit herself into a mold that wasn't hers. She had conformed to the image of what others wanted her to be. But now, walking alongside Ethan, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in years, she wasn't worried about maintaining an image or meeting expectations. She wasn't concerned with how others saw her. She wasn't bound by the need for validation or approval. She was simply herself, standing in the freedom of making her own choices, of defining her own path. Choosing freedom wasn't about abandoning everything she had worked for. It was about realizing that none of it mattered if she wasn't living her truth. The wealth, the power, the empire, they were all just symbols of success that the world had imposed upon her. But true success, true happiness, came from within. It came from the ability to choose for herself, to live without the pressure of others' expectations, and to find peace in who she was not, who others wanted her to be. And so, as they reached the edge of the airport, away from the flashing cameras and the media frenzy, Isabella made a choice. She chose freedom. She chose a life with Ethan, not because she had to leave everything behind, but because she realized that if she wasn't living true to herself, then everything she had built would never be enough. It wasn't the wealth, the title, or the legacy that gave life meaning. It was the simple, unspoken truths, like walking barefoot with someone who truly saw her, someone who didn't need her to be anything other than herself. With every step she took beside Ethan, Isabella felt lighter. She was walking into a future where she could finally be free. Free to love, free to be herself, and free to live a life that was her own to create. It wasn't about what she had left behind. It was about what she had gained: the freedom to choose a life filled with authenticity, love, and happiness. And for the first time in her life, Isabella knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of Isabella and Ethan carries a powerful message about the true nature of love and freedom. In a world where appearances often hold more weight than substance, where success is measured by wealth, status, and external validation, this tale reminds us that the most profound love doesn't reside in luxury or titles. It is found in truth, courage, and sincerity. Love in its purest form is not about grand gestures, flashy displays, or seeking approval from the outside world. It is about making a choice to embrace the most essential values in life: honesty, authenticity, and the freedom to be ourselves. Throughout her life, Isabella had been taught to chase the things that society deemed important: money, success, and influence. These were the markers of her worth, the things that defined her place in the world. But when she met Ethan, a man whose life was grounded in simple hard work and a quiet integrity, she began to see that the true essence of life was not in what you accumulate, but in the connections you make, the people you love, and the choices you make to live authentically. Ethan, with his unpolished exterior and humble demeanor, had nothing to prove to anyone. He had no desire for fame or wealth. His life was built on values that were far more enduring: hard work, loyalty, and the courage to remain true to himself. Through him, Isabella discovered that love was not something to be bought or earned through power. It was something that grew out of mutual respect, trust, and a shared commitment to the truth. Choosing freedom and love meant that Isabella had to let go of everything she had been conditioned to believe about success and happiness. It was a difficult choice, but one that opened her eyes to the deeper truths about herself and the world around her. True love, she realized, was not about living up to the expectations of others or maintaining a facade. It was about embracing the truth of who you are, accepting that you are worthy, without the need for external validation, and finding joy in the simplest, most genuine moments. In letting go of her wealth, her status, and the life she had built, Isabella chose a path of freedom, a freedom that allowed her to step away from the pressures of a world that valued appearances over authenticity. She chose to walk alongside Ethan, not because of what he could give her, but because he saw her for who she truly was: a woman capable of love, vulnerability, and strength. This story teaches us that true love and freedom are found not in the pursuit of material wealth or external approval, but in choosing to live according to our core values. It reminds us that love is about acceptance, understanding, and choosing the people and values that resonate with our authentic selves. True freedom is not found in running away from the world, but in choosing to live a life that is true to who we are without fear or pretense. And in the end, that is the kind of love and freedom that lasts unwavering, enduring, and real. As the engines of the jet hummed to life, Isabella and Ethan stood hand in hand looking out into the vast expanse of the open sky. The flashing lights of cameras, the chaos of the reporters, and the weight of expectations all seemed to fade into the distance. For the first time, Isabella felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she was making the right choice. The life she had lived, the empire she had built, the expectations of those around her. It all seemed so distant now. It wasn't about the riches or the legacy anymore. It was about something far deeper, living authentically, being true to herself, and choosing the person she wanted to be, without the weight of anyone else's expectations. Hand in hand they boarded the jet, not as a CEO and a mechanic, but as two people who had found something rare and real in each other. The future was uncertain. Yes, but it was also full of possibility. They weren't bound by the roles they had been born into, or the paths that had been set for them. They had chosen their own journey, one of freedom, love, and authenticity. The story ends here, not with a grand resolution, but with an open door to a new beginning. Isabella and Ethan's journey is just starting, and the road ahead is theirs to pave. What comes next is unknown, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that they are no longer defined by their past or their titles. They have chosen to walk together side by side into a future where they can live on their own terms. The open sky before them is a symbol of the freedom they've found, a freedom to choose love over status, to live true to themselves and to embrace the unknown. As they look ahead, they don't know what challenges they will face, but they know that they will face them together. And that in itself is the beginning of a new adventure, one that will be defined not by expectations, but by the choices they make and the love they share.